January of 2025, it was 36.2 trillion. It's now 39.2 trillion. And as you can see in this chart, the trajectory of this debt is just going up and up and up. And the CBO right now says that debt held by the public is 99% of the gross domestic product. Is that something that we should tolerate? Again, it's a complicated question. That number is not abstract. It is your money, your children's money, and your grandchildren's money, already spoken for. If you pay taxes, this hearing was about you. Watch every second of what follows, because the answers given in that room tell you exactly how seriously Washington takes the hole it has dug. Support opportunity zones. They've been helpful to Vermont. But number two, I want to talk about what I think is a looming crisis that gets far too little attention in this Congress, and that's the national debt. And I know you're familiar with this. I'm just going to show the chart for others. The projections of the debt. First of all, January of 2025, it was 36.2 trillion. It's now 39.2 trillion. And as you can see in this chart, the trajectory of this debt is just going up and up and up. And the CBO right now says that debt held by the public is 99% of GDP, and it's scheduled to go up to 120% by 2030. And we're now paying interest, as you know, probably better than anybody, of $970 billion. So taxpayer revenues are going $970 billion to debt service, which exceeds our entire military budget. And that obviously means we can't spend it on other things that folks in Mr. Crapo's district and folks in my district actually need. Federal interest payments rose to 18.5% of all of our revenues, and the CBO says that's going to go up to 25.8% by 2036. And we don't talk about it at all. It's not even a topic, which is astonishing to me because it's such a threat. The central controversy of this testimony is happening right now. Secretary Bessent did not dispute a single number. He simply let the figures stand on the official record. Nearly $1 trillion a year in interest alone, surpassing the entire defense budget, is leaving the Treasury before a single road gets repaired or a veteran gets care. By 2036, the CBO warns, 1 in 4 tax dollars will go strictly to pay interest. Before we continue to the next clip, it leaves every taxpayer to consider whether rising interest costs or spending discipline is Washington's biggest challenge. Watch what happens as Senator Welch pivots directly to IRS staffing cuts. Now, there's 3 ways to address debt. 1, we can cut spending. 2, we can raise revenues. And I don't want to talk about those 2 today. But there's one other where I think there should be consensus, and that's collecting the revenues that taxpayers already owe. And that's why I want to talk to you a little bit about the staffing cuts that I understand have taken place at the IRS, which has reduced their capacity to collect revenues owed by taxpayers. In fiscal year 2027, IRS enforcement funding was cut by, 2,800 staff positions were reduced. And that's in addition to 26% of revenue agents lost in 2025. I've got a revenue chart here that was prepared by the Peterson Foundation, and I find them to be extremely credible on debt issues. I don't know if you share my high opinion of them. Not anymore. Laughter. Well, I think they've lost their way. Well, all right, we'll disagree on that. I find them to be an extremely credible source. But what this chart shows is that as we've increased the cutting of revenue agents, the loss of owed revenue. This is owed revenue. We're not talking about increasing anybody's taxes. You're talking about the tax gap. That's right. The tax gap is projected to be $1.8 trillion. So the obvious question here is, why are we cutting the people we need at the IRS to do the audits, to collect revenues that are due to the Treasury? Secretary Bessent's laugh when Senator Welch mentioned the Peterson Foundation shifted the entire tone of this hearing. The Peterson Foundation was created by Pete Peterson, a former Republican Commerce Secretary, specifically to sound the alarm on federal debt. Dismissing it with a chuckle moved the spotlight away from the actual math and onto the credibility of the source. Yet that $1.8 trillion tax gap is not an outside theory. It comes straight from the IRS itself. If Washington knows that nearly $2 trillion in owed revenue is sitting uncollected, why reduce the workforce responsible for recovering it, rather than strengthening them? That fundamental question leaves taxpayers to evaluate the practical impact of these staffing cuts. Watch how Secretary Bessent defends the decision by challenging growth forecasts and citing a new whistleblower report. Senator, couple of things. Let's backtrack to your previous chart. The Peterson Institute, CBO, project that we were going to grow at 1.8%. Thus far in this administration, we've grown at 2. Let me interrupt. It's 1.8% forever. We've grown at 2.6%. No. Let me just stay on the revenue. Because whether we grow at 1.8, as they say, or 2.8, whatever it is you say, you'd agree with me that if I'm a taxpayer and I owe money, I should pay it. And I can tell you that more bodies does not equal better collections. So you just disagree? Here, let me read you something. TIGTA, the IRS's internal reporting system. A whistleblower in Atlanta came out and said a 25-year IRS employee who trained 2,700 new IRS agents. I'm going to have to interrupt because my time is running out. I'll be happy to send this to you. It'll show you why it's a complete fallacy. More bodies does not equal better collections. That single statement from Secretary Bessent cuts to the core of the debate over federal auditing. While efficiency is a valid management goal, Treasury Department studies have consistently shown that specialized enforcement on complex returns yields between $5 and $9 for every dollar spent. Pivoting to an Atlanta whistleblower report allowed the Secretary to highlight training issues rather than address the IRS's proven return on investment. If cutting experienced auditors risks losing more revenue than it saves, taxpayers are left to weigh the real cost of government downsizing. This centers the debate on whether tax enforcement should prioritize staff headcount or direct corporate compliance. Watch what happens as Senator Welch turns the spotlight onto major corporations using offshore tax havens like Jersey and Cyprus. Last year we had recoveries up on collection. Can I just get a little extra time? Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Number 1. I absolutely believe that people who owe money should be paying that money, and that we should have assertive enforcement to get that collected, regardless of the growth rate. That's number 1. Number 2. One of the things happening is we've withdrawn from the global effort for coordinated organization for economic cooperation, and companies are now using low-tax dodge countries like American Express has waived $423 million in taxes by using the island of Jersey, saying that's where they do their work. Black & Decker cut their bill by $27 million using Cyprus. Many companies use Malta. S&P Global cut its tax bill by $269 million. Is that something we should tolerate? Clears throat. No. Thank you. And will you do something about it? Again, it's a complicated question, and I'm happy to come to your office, happy to do another phone call, as we've done. All right, I will follow up. I don't want to send you this report that shows the new agents were a disaster. Secretary Bessent's flat no was the most revealing concession of the entire hearing. When Senator Welch laid out hard numbers, American Express avoiding $423 million through Jersey, S&P Global cutting $269 million, Black & Decker using Cyprus. The Treasury Secretary did not defend those maneuvers. He looked directly at the committee and agreed, on the record, that this practice should not be tolerated. But retreating behind the word complicated the moment actionable solutions were raised exposes the central contradiction facing Washington. These corporate tax shelters are not victimless paper transactions. When hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate revenue are routed into offshore jurisdictions with 0% tax rates, that missing money doesn't simply vanish. It compounds a $39.2 trillion national debt, fuels federal borrowing costs, and shifts the financial burden directly onto the shoulders of everyday American taxpayers. For millions of older Americans living on fixed incomes, persistent deficits put immense long-term pressure on essential safety nets like Social Security and Medicare, while draining resources from basic infrastructure and veterans' care. Admitting a systemic loophole exists is straightforward. Having the regulatory resolve to close it is where real fiscal accountability gets tested. To understand the significance of the corporate examples Welch presented, consider how these offshore structures actually operate. The island of Jersey is a British Crown dependency with a corporate tax rate of 0. American Express didn't move its operations there. Its executives didn't relocate. Its products didn't change. What changed was where, on paper, certain profits were recorded. That's not a technicality. That's the architecture of modern corporate tax avoidance. And it works because companies can book profits in a jurisdiction where no meaningful economic activity occurs, simply because the laws there allow it, and no binding international agreement forces them to do otherwise. For decades, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, was building exactly that kind of binding agreement. The global minimum tax framework known as Pillar 2 was designed to set a floor of 15% on corporate taxes worldwide, so that no matter where a company claimed to have earned its profits, a baseline rate would apply. Over 130 countries signed on. The United States, under the current administration, stepped back from that framework. The practical effect: American multinationals operating in low-tax jurisdictions now face less international pressure than before, and the countries that stayed in the agreement may begin imposing their own top-up taxes on profits earned by U.S. companies, meaning foreign governments could end up collecting revenue that should have gone to Washington instead. Bessent knows all of this in extraordinary detail. He came to government from the world of high finance, where understanding the geography of global capital flows is not optional. Characterizing the issue as complicated reflects a measured approach to a deeply entrenched international tax system. Senator Welch used those closing 30 seconds to narrow the hearing down to a fundamental standard of accountability. He didn't ask Bessent to commit to a policy. He didn't ask him to back a specific piece of legislation. He framed complex economic figures into one direct question of government accountability. Should this be tolerated? And the Secretary said no. That answer now exists in the public record. It can be read back at the next hearing. It can be cited in the next committee markup. A direct refusal on the record from a Treasury Secretary sets a clear benchmark for future congressional oversight. Beyond the committee exchange, the data surrounding the tax gap exposes the broader structural reality of federal revenue. The IRS estimates that the annual gap between taxes owed and taxes collected in the United States runs between $600 billion and $700 billion per year for individuals and small businesses alone. Add in large corporations and offshore arrangements of the kind Welch described, incredible outside estimates push the total toward $1.8 trillion, as Welch's Peterson Foundation chart showed. To put that scale in perspective, recovering even half of that uncollected revenue could fund the entire Department of Veterans Affairs 3 times over, without raising tax rates on everyday citizens. The factors driving this persistent shortfall are well documented. Closing the gap requires enforcement, and enforcement requires people, and the people who do that work have been cut. The IRS lost roughly 30% of its revenue agents between 2010 and 2023, even before the most recent rounds of reductions. The agency was auditing high-income returns at the lowest rate in recorded history before the 2022 funding boost briefly reversed the trend. Now that trend is reversing again, and more bodies does not equal better collections, is the public rationale being offered for why that's acceptable. What makes this politically unusual is that the argument Welch was making, collect taxes that are already legally owed, rather than raise rates or cut services, is one of the few fiscal arguments that doesn't require taking money from anyone paying their fair share. It requires taking money from people and corporations who are legally obligated to pay, and have found ways not to. While that principle suggests potential bipartisan agreement, the policy debate remains deeply divided. One explanation: the people most exposed to serious IRS enforcement are also the people who can most easily afford sophisticated legal and accounting representation, and who have historically had more political influence over how enforcement priorities are set. When audit rates on wealthy filers drop, it isn't purely a matter of budget constraints. It also reflects decisions about where to direct limited resources. Decisions made by human beings operating inside a system where those same wealthy filers fund political campaigns, hire lobbyists, and maintain relationships with the people setting those priorities. This reflects standard institutional lobbying and how regulatory priorities get established. And it's exactly the kind of structural reality that a hearing like this one, 2 elected officials talking over each other in a room full of cameras, rarely has the time or the architecture to actually fix. What stands out from this exchange is the stark contrast between verified economic data and the reluctance to commit to immediate reform. Senator Welch came to that hearing armed with charts, specific numbers, named corporations, and a clear argument. What he got back was a laugh at his source, a pivot to a whistleblower story out of Atlanta, a one-word answer followed by the word complicated, and he had to ask for extra time just to finish his questions. Ultimately, addressing America's multi-trillion-dollar balance sheet will require decisive choices. With interest on the debt now outpacing defense spending and corporations shielding hundreds of millions abroad, the debate over how to fund our government is just beginning. Whether the solution lies in stronger enforcement against offshore tax havens or broader spending discipline remains a central question for every taxpayer. If you appreciate balanced, in-depth reporting on the economic issues shaping our country, please subscribe to the Politics Report. Thank you for tuning in.